A question that I hear a lot, and an aim that I also see within a lot of Christians, especially Adventists, and particularly Adventists, is what does it mean to be perfect? And can we be perfect? I want us to look at creation again as to give us a bit of an answer into what does it mean to be perfect. Now, as you've probably read through Genesis chapter 1, you've recognized that at the end of every day there's a certain phrase that is repeated, that God saw that it was good. Now, God had made everything, as we would describe it, perfect. But that's not how God describes it. He didn't look at creation and say that it was perfect. He said that it was good. And what is the difference between the word perfect and the word good? If you remember, there was a man that came to him, to Jesus that is, and called him good master. And Jesus said to him, there is none good but God. And so we would say, well, God is perfect. But Jesus here is referring to his goodness. And in creation, he created everything to be good. So what is the difference? And does it change the things that we aim for? Now, I don't want us to get confused, because I know in this day and age we like to use the word good and bad. Oh, but I'm a good person, therefore I'll make it to heaven. Or that's a bad person, therefore he'll go to hell. Now, obviously this is an oversimplification, but you get the point. The idea is that our definition of good seems to be a little bit less than God's definition of good. Everything that God created was good, and at the very end, on the sixth day, as he looks back over all of it, he recognizes that it is very good. And this plays into his ability on the seventh day to rest. Now, God doesn't need to rest. God doesn't get tired. God works all the time. But it's a different kind of rest. This is a rest of completion, meaning that the things that he had made, he saw within it everything that was needed for it to continue to grow. One of the main differences between perfect and good is that our idea of perfect is generally very static. It's this idea that we've attained to something, we've reached the pinnacle of what can be achieved, and therefore there's no more need for growth. And God has never intended that for his creation. Now, God does not change because he is perfect. And so when he calls us to be like him, he's not saying that we need to reach the point where there's no more achievement. He's calling us to the other aspect, and that is to his goodness. And when we look at creation, that all of it was good, it was given something, and that is sufficiency. It received its sufficiency or its fulfillment or fullness in God, meaning that to the extent that it trusted in God, it would always have what it needed for whatever growth or process it was to be engaged in. The moment that we actually break from our dependency on God is when we lose our ability to be good or become good. You could even say to become better. The moment that we separate from God, we lose the ability to improve, to grow, to mature. And so we can't actually grow into the measure of the man or woman that God desires us to be apart from God's goodness. Now, this is important to understand because it is different from the idea of perfection. Once again, that's the idea that it's something that can be achieved where once achieved, there's nothing left. You've reached the top. Now, at some point in time when we talk about the sanctuary, I'm going to introduce two different ideas of perfection. One that is more akin to good, and one that actually is the type of perfection that God himself is. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. We're not going to discuss that here in the book of Genesis. I want you to think of an artist's piece. There's some pretty famous pieces out there, but let's just take a common statue, the statue of David by Michelangelo. There has to come a point where Michelangelo decided that if he was going to chip away any further at the statue, he'd ruin it. Not that the statue was perfect, but that it was complete and that it had reached the idea of what he had intended for it. And each and every one of us has a purpose in God's eyes. And to the extent that God saw that it was good, it had already reached what God had intended for it. He had given it everything that it needed. This is the problem, and I would say the struggle, since the fall in chapter 3 of Genesis. The question remains, did God give us enough? Did he do enough? Did he leave anything out? Because the question posed at the tree of knowledge of good and evil is that God held something back. There's no reason that God should have rested and looked at his creation and called it very good. So there's no reason to Sabbath, because in reality, he didn't give it all that it needed. There's something more that needs to be attained. There's something more that needs to be sought for. God was able to Sabbath or rest because he saw within all that he did that he had done enough. Any more would have ruined it. And so the rest that he calls us into is not as much a physical rest, though that can be a part of it. It's a rest in trust. It's a rest that we can be at peace with God and that he has created us just as he wanted us. We don't have to overreach ourselves to become anything more than what he created us to be. But that becomes tricky because we're not in the Garden of Eden anymore. We've made mistakes. We've fallen far from the image that God has intended for us. So now is the question of, how can I be accepted as I am and at the same time not remain as I am, because as I am is not how God created me? That's hard sometimes to understand, because there's a tendency to say, well, God accepts me as I am. He created me this way, therefore I'm going to stay this way. So how do we make sense of God's acceptance of us, as well as the fact that we need to change? How do we actually change, but at the same time rest? How do we work so that we can move forward and become more like the image which we have lost, but at the same time rest the way that God has called us to? How can we be at peace with God when we're at war with ourselves? I want you to take a minute to recognize who the book of Genesis was being written by. It was written by Moses. Now, Moses was born way after the events of Genesis ever occurred. But he's writing this for a reason, and I think the way that he frames even the creation and all of the stories are within a way that God had led him that would be most relevant to a people that were coming out of Egypt. Now, what were the children of Israel in Egypt? They were slaves. What was their value within the context of slavery? Well, their value was in relation to what they could produce. If you don't produce, you have no value to the empire. Let's say that somebody would disagree with the idea that their value was somehow bound up in their ability to produce. You know, a lot of us are bound up in that type of mentality even today. Just like it was in Egypt, so today our value is oftentimes tied very closely to what we can produce. I remember watching an award show one time, long time ago, where a particular artist came and they basically said that I'm worth $200 million. Their value was directly bound to the amount of money that they could make with their records. Many of us, our value is directly tied to our net worth, or to what position we hold. The fact that somebody wants to have a higher position, whether within government or whether within society. You know how we say, hey, are you going to become a doctor or a lawyer, like we like to get all our kids to do? Don't be a trash man or, a policeman or fireman. Those are nice jobs and they're very useful to society, but quite frankly, they don't hold a lot of clout or prestige. So don't pursue those, even though they're necessary. The idea that your value is tied to what you have or your standing within society is nothing new. And even if you disagree with it, for all practical purposes, you have to go along with it. You can't live apart from it. And so imagine for a Jew within the context of Egypt saying something like, well, my value isn't directly tied to the amount of bricks that I can make, or the amount of artworks that I can produce, or the brass or ironwork that I can make. Yeah, that sounds nice, but if you think about it, if he didn't do those things, and if he didn't do those things well, then he would be removed from the empire, because he has no value to the empire. And so then what would happen to his wife and children? Well, we all know what the empire wants to do with their wife and children. They're already slaves. They're already seen as property. And so you can say things within the world that we live in today, well, I don't agree with its philosophy, and that's fine, because I don't either. But at the end of the day, many of us are still tied to it, because if we don't do some of the things that it's requiring of us, what position does that put the rest of us? What position does that put our family in? What position does that put our children in? And so it's harder to escape than you normally think. And we can disagree with it all day long, but in all practical sense, we have to go along with it to some extent. So how do we escape it? How do we continue to work within it and yet still have the rest and peace that God has called us to do? Well, it does have to do a lot with our mindset. Now, why mindset is so important is for the reason that I'm convinced that everything begins in the mind. Now, I don't think that everything needs to stay purely in the mind, because you can be convinced of something and never have it actually make any changes within your real practical existence. But everything does begin in the mind. If your mind isn't changed about something, you can never hope that there will be any physical or outward change to it. And so it starts with a mindset. And so the current mindset that is being portrayed by the dominant narrative of the empire is that your value is directly tied to what you can produce, and not necessarily who you are. Now, when you look at the days of creation, there's something different about the day of creation than the day to day. And what I mean by that is that the day to day begins in the morning, not at night. But the day at creation begins at night. And so you see the evening and the morning, the evening and the morning. So the question is, why does the day start in the evening? Well, once again, who's this being written to? It's being written to a group of people that have just escaped slavery. And God has basically created the world already intentionally with everything in mind to let us know that our value doesn't start with production. It starts with our belonging. It says that God created us in His image. In His image. And so the very fact that we were created like Him is the greatest value that we can receive from the get-go. Before we even work, before we name the animals, before we tend to the garden, before we till the ground, before we offer our sacrifices, before we build an ark, before we leave our parents' house, before any of the things that we do that we're called to do, we're like God, in His image. Now, mind you, I understand that we've fallen far from that. But who do we belong to is far more important of a question than what can we produce. Now, what does that have to do with the day? The day starting in the evening means that the day starts with something. Rest. Why? Because that's what you do in the evening. In the morning you work. The context of today, the empire says your day starts in the morning. You work so that you can rest. In God's context, the day starts in the evening. You rest so that you can work. Because you find your value in God, because you find your value in the fact that you were created to be like Him, now you can work. Wherein today or I guess you could even say within the Egyptian narrative, is you have to earn your rest. God says no. You don't earn your rest because of what you've done. Because you've rested in me and recognized that I've given you enough and that I've made you enough. You belong to me and that I accept you. Now it's your time to work. And so what is the balance between rest and work? In reality, it's not a balance as much as it is an order. The order is that we rest first. We trust in God first. We accept the fact that He has called us by name, that He wants to redeem us, that He's given us all that we need for salvation within a fallen world. And now we can work because we've achieved the promise. We've attained to all that we need and we've been provided all that we need. And now that we have all that we need, why wouldn't we work since we have all the resources at our disposal? God says that I will give good gifts to you. If you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more? How much more will your Father give to those who ask? Now, we're going to come to that in just a minute, because I do want us to relate Genesis as well as the Exodus with the Sermon on the Mount, because the Sermon on the Mount pulls so much out of these first few chapters of Genesis, probably a whole lot more than you think. And God answers a lot of these questions as well through the words of Jesus, which, quite frankly, when Jesus speaks, we listen. And he's giving us a whole lot of counsel in relation to these things, but I'm going to keep you in suspense just a little bit, if I could, in relation to that. God has given us enough. You and I are never going to be God, but we can become like him. We're never going to reach that perfect attainment, that pinnacle of perfection that God himself is. But we can grow continuously, trusting in God each step of the way. And so there's two aspects. There's the rest aspect to our faith, and there's the working aspect to our faith. The rest aspect comes by faith. We trust in God that he has made provision. We trust in God that he is representing us as perfect can be. And now, we work because we've rested. Our day no longer begins in the morning trying to earn our way towards rest, but our day begins in the evening. We rest in God, recognizing what he's called us to do, what he's given us. And now, because he's provided all things for our benefit and for our growth, we can work. You know, one of the interesting things is that as the children of Israel were coming out of Egypt, not all of them had the changed mindset. Now they had freedom, that physical freedom. They escaped that 9-to-5 rat race. They escaped those cultural norms where your value is based particularly upon what you can produce or provide for society. They were in the desert where none of that mattered. And yet, what do they want? They wanted all of that back. They wanted all of that back. So you can understand that the mindset is extremely important, because if the mind has changed, even if you give somebody physical freedom, it doesn't mean that they're free in reality. But in the same way, just because you've changed somebody's mind, but in the same way, just because you've changed somebody's mind doesn't mean that they're free either. God wants us to be free in two ways. He wants us to be free within our minds, hearts, and wills, to choose him of our own volition, to understand the truth with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our heart, to love him with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our hearts, but also within the physical, that there's a real, tangible, visible transformation, a change of life, perhaps even a change of environment, a change of job. The perspective, if it changes but doesn't change anything within your life, then you've not really grasped it or believed it. We can sometimes mentally ascend to certain ideals, but if no change takes place in the life, then did we really believe them? Did we really grasp them? See, it has to be real. It has to take place within reality for it to be true. If it doesn't do anything, and quite frankly, this is why most people don't believe in Christianity, is because so many people claim things, but they don't reflect those things that they claim. Why would anybody trust that? If all it does is end at the thoughts and doesn't change anything within the life, what's the point? There is no point. And so one without the other is void, in the same way that James says, "Show me your faith without thy works, and I will show you my faith by my works." Once again, we're coming to this idea of faith and works, but rest and work. See, faith is rest, work is work. Which comes first? If you don't believe that God is, then you can't become like him, because now you've lost your frame of reference. You don't have a standard or an absolute that you can aim for. Everything becomes subjective, and living within the narrative that the empire presents becomes normal. You can now actually live the Egyptian life. You can value yourself in accordance with what you can give to society. You can be like that musician whose value is $200 million. Maybe you can even go beyond that. Maybe you can achieve $500 million, or maybe even over $1 billion. You can become the next tech giant and have every single thing that society would value. But that doesn't mean you're going to have rest. In fact, I would argue that most people that have achieved a great amount of success within the Egyptian narrative have achieved great amounts of things through work. But rest is something that continuously eludes them. However, the Christian is different. The Christian is different because none of those things, not that they don't matter, but they don't have the same weight or value. Work is good. Achievement is good. Doing great things within the world are great. I mean, we've been created to achieve great things. Whatever your hand findeth to do, do it with all your might, we're told. I know it sounds simplistic. Just saying, yeah, it's just, all that matters is to who you belong. But what God is trying to portray throughout the rest of Scripture are actually pretty simple ideas. One is a mindset of abundance, and the other is a mindset of scarcity. Because if you look at the Egyptian narrative, if you look at the slave mentality, it's always an object of scarcity. Am I enough? Do I do enough? Am I pretty enough, smart enough, good enough? Can I attain to the expectations of family, of society, of friends? And we're always falling short, and we always will fall short. No, I don't understand why somebody who has $100 billion is not happy with $100 billion. They always want more. They feel like it's not enough, and now that they have it, they're in fear that they might lose it. As if you needed $100 billion to have a good life. But the idea is because they don't have that rest, they don't have that peace, they don't have that trust, they don't find their sufficiency in the one who has called them. They have a mindset of scarcity even though they have so much. You don't have to have a lot to have a mindset of abundance. When you've accepted Christ and you recognize that He has promised you everything and that to Him you are everything, and that if you were the only one that had fallen, He would have just as readily sent His Son to die on the cross for just you, that your value is equal in God's eyes to His own Son's, that He's going to give you a place to rule on thrones. He has made us a nation of kings and priests. Like, why? Go back to Psalm chapter 8. What is man that thou art mindful of him, is the question. Why do you value us so much? Why do you care for us so much? But when you look at Jesus and you see that He does, and He says things like, I know the thoughts that I have towards you, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a hope in a future. When He says things like, if any of you lack, ask. If any of you lack wisdom, ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally and does not hold back. God wants to give us everything. He's given us everything. There's no reason for a mindset of scarcity. But as we'll see with Cain and Abel in one of our following studies, that this is a very real and true mentality. This idea of, am I enough? Do I have enough? What do I have to do to achieve more? And this other idea, I belong to God. What else do I need? In the words of the psalmist in chapter 73, whom have I in heaven but Thee? And on earth there is none that I desire but Thee. My flesh and my heart may fail, but You, O Lord, are the strength of my heart and my inheritance forever. You're all that I want. You're all that I need. And if I have You, who cares if I don't have anything else? I can finally be at rest.